With that, I want to thank Jonathan. Thank you so much. And we'll hopefully get the dance later. Next up are 4 contributed talks. First up is Juan Castiñeras from the Champollion Foundation, telling us about optimal control of spiking neural networks. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So I would like to start by thanking the organizers for the opportunity to present our work in this fantastic event. And I'm very honored for that, and also to thank the foundation and the sponsors for making this possible. So I have to start by saying that this is a collaboration with my amazing colleague Tiago and my amazing Pierre Alfonso. And any of us could give this talk today, but today is me. And I would like to thank also the rest of my lab and the funding sources. All right, so in the study of functional approaches to neural computation, there are 2 alternative views. The first one is the one we call the standard RNN approach, in which the weights of an RNN are trained to perform a particular task. And here, the external input is usually simple and static, mainly there to provide context. So this is the most popular approach. But then there's the other approach we call the control approach, in which there's explicit modular distinction between the plant that's being controlled and a control input. And this external control input now is dynamic and plays a non-trivial role. And the local dynamics are going to be usually fixed and adapted to a specific task. So we can see several aspects in which these control roles are involved. And we can also think of pairs of brain areas that could fit into this division of controller and plant. So our goal is going to be, given a task and a network plan to control, find the efficient inputs to control its dynamics. And we want this to be born from spikes, and also we want a mathematically transparent framework. So the way we set up the problem is that we have an RNN of an homogeneous Poisson spiking neurons, and as I already mentioned, the connectivity is fixed. And what we want is to shape the dynamics of this network through external control signals such that it performs a certain function. So an RNN like this one generates activity, and one way to look at it is through the high-dimensional state of the filter spikes of each neuron. But John already introduced very nicely that we can here apply a constraint, which is assuming that the connectivity is low rank, such that the dynamics of the network is described by this set of low-dimensional latent variables. And this means that then we can predict it up to determine the memory potential of the neurons. And then when passed by a spiking nonlinearity, it produces spikes. And then this will close the loop back to the beginning. So given this setup, it's not obvious how the optimal control should be applied. In principle, it could act in an arbitrary nonlinear way. But since we want something interpretable, we are going to impose our first decided datum, which is that we want the control to act simply as linear input to each neuron. So I'm going to put it up there to not forget. And then let's move on how to find a more concrete form of this linear control input. So we have our low-dimensional state that describes the activity of the network. And then we will follow a dynamic programming approach in which we define some reward function, such that the optimal control will be the one that maximizes the cumulative reward over the trajectory until some target is reached. We call this quantity the value function. So what is the form of this reward function that is going to be optimized? There's an instantaneous reward, and then also a terminal reward that gets received when the target is reached. And this instantaneous reward, we can decompose it in 2 terms. First, we have a cost of time that is there to give some time pressure to reach the target. And crucially, there's a cost of control term. So how do we understand this cost of control? So let's draw again the space with some current state and then the target. And we have this, so the default policy is what the network does in the absence of control. And then we have the optimal policy. So then we have this function C that measures the difference between the default and the optimal policies, or in other words, the amount of conflict. And then we have this constant beta that we call the control gain here. And this measures the sensitivity to this conflict. So if the control gain is high, the optimal policy can deviate a lot from the default policy. and aim towards the target in a direct way. But if the control gain is low, then the optimal policy has to stick close to the default, which creates an interesting computational problem. All right, so now let's imagine that we already have the value function. What would a reasonable optimal policy look like? So the value function would look like this, a surface that has the maximum at the target and then decreases away from it. And we can imagine that any spike from any neuron will change slightly the state here, and the optimal policy is trying to control the probabilities of spiking to maximize the value. So for instance, let's suppose we have this neuron here that when it spikes, it moves the state to a region of lower value. Then the controller should inhibit that neuron. Conversely, if you have this other neuron that makes the state move to a region of higher value, the controller would like to excite that neuron. So then, wouldn't it be nice if the optimal policy, the optimal additive control input that we're trying to find would just be directly proportional to this difference in value? So this quantity here will be just the contribution of a spike into the low-dimensional state. And since we have many neurons, we can write this as directly proportional to the gradient of the value. So this is going to be our second and last datum. We want the control input to be proportional to the gradient of the value function. So can we satisfy both the serial data? Well, I wouldn't be telling you this if we couldn't, so yes, we can. And we call this the principle of conjugate control. And basically, for any invertible spiking linearity function f, there is a control cost divergent function c such that the serial data are both satisfied. And here are some examples that we calculated. We started with this one that is interesting because the exponential linearity is associated with the KL control, the KL divergence, and this is something that has been very well explored. But for the rest of the talk, I'm actually going to be using a sigmoidal nonlinearity. So finally, all that is left to obtain is the value function, which implies solving the Bellman equation that it follows. And we solve this numerically with a particular type of deep neural network specially suited for this kind of problems, the so-called deep Galar-King architecture. All right, so now let's move into some results. I have two sets of results, one about state control and the other one about decision making. So what I mean by state control is the setting in which the low-dimensional state defines also a low-dimensional readout. And then this can be arranged, for instance, as a center outreaching task. So then the task the controller needs to solve is to reach the designated target as efficiently as possible. So in this example, we set up the connectivity such that there is a low manifold in the default dynamics in the network here in the diagonal. So then we can see how the control dynamics looks for a case with high control gain. As you can see, it goes quite directly and strongly towards the target. Here, the background color is also the strength of the default dynamics, but we can also show it now in the background having the value function. And the situation turns more interesting when we increase the control cost by decreasing the control gain. So now we see that the control dynamics changes dramatically, and it becomes much more similar to the default. So basically, the optimal policy tries to exploit the slow manifold here as much as possible, and only deviate from it when it's sufficiently close to the target. And this is just an example to show that there's rich phenomenology depending on the interplay between passive dynamics and the control gain. So in the last few moments, let me tell you now about the other set of results concerning decision making. So now the controller needs to choose between two targets, but which is the correct target is only determined by the latent variable of some noisy observations. So this implies that there needs to be some inference in order to tell the correct side, and this inference needs to inform the value function to influence the policy. So there needs to be encoding of inference, then encoding the evidence, performing the inference, and then the controller needs to balance the speed and accuracy to commit at the appropriate time. So a challenge in this setting is that the terminal value of the target is not known in advance. It depends on the observations, and it changes over time. So in fact, the correct terminal value to use should be proportional to the expected reward of the target, which is given by the probability of being correct if the target is selected. This is what we call the belief, and Adrian introduced very nicely the concept of belief already. So the belief then defines the terminal reward that has to be given as an input to the controller. We assume that this is given externally, perhaps by another brain area. And therefore, we set the state space now to enlarge to include the belief, but the controller acts only on the network, the same as before. And this creates a beautiful setting where we have a categorical choice in a continuous action space, which allows us to study the dynamics of decision commitment. So now let's look at the solutions that we get. So the solution is going to depend strongly on the magnitude of the terminal reward relative to the cost of time. And this is, in a case now with high terminal reward, this is how the dynamics look for a belief equal to 1, which means that the agent is convinced that the correct target is the right one. So the value, which is in the color, is also higher on the target. But now I can show you how it looks for different values of belief. And for instance, notice that for belief 0.5, now the value is high here in the middle. And this actually implies that in this case, we see the network doing examples of deliberation. You see that the belief is fluctuating, and the state is also tracking these fluctuations. And the network only commits when the belief is sufficiently clear. Therefore, in this case, there are very few errors. And this kind of flexibility is hard to capture in a model that is not using a control signal of this kind. But then when we go to a situation of low terminal reward, we see now examples of the dynamics. You can notice that now the value high in the middle here is gone. And this implies that now the network does impulsive errors. And this is because it pays off to commit early to avoid temporal costs. And now also the accuracy depends clearly on the strength of the evidence. Finally, we can ask ourselves, even if the action space is continuous, the system, if we can see that the system develops a non-trivial notion of categorical commitment. So in order to do that, let's focus on what happens for extreme values of belief. For instance, belief 0, which means that the evidence favors unambiguously the left target. So what would the agent decide if it were to be here? Sorry, here. So it's very close to the. It's very close to this target, but what's going to happen if we run this and we move this point around, we're going to see that actually there's many cases, particularly in the low terminal reward setting, where the network chooses to make a mistake. And we think that this is something that we can see, particularly because of the interaction, the interplay between the cost of time, the dynamics of the belief, and the emergence of, it gives to this emergence of zones of no return in continuous action spaces. So finally, let me finalize with some bits of ongoing work, particularly something that is quite exciting for us. So I've been telling you about this setting of the decision making where we give already the belief to the value, to the policy and to the value. But you could consider a situation in which now the plant receives directly the observations. This is a more challenging situation because now the controller would need to shape the plant such that the plant itself can be able to integrate evidence that then it will be the necessary component to perform the decisions correctly. And that's it. I would like to thank you, and I will take the questions.